Waje, Nishinagasu, and Aretha. I wanted to talk to you today about something that, I don't know, if you work in Indigenous spaces. So I, for example, I'm a program director for an Indigenous film festival. And so I get people submitting films to our film festival all the time. And, you know, one of the things that really we had to really talk about was Indigenous identity. And it is so complicated. It's not as easy as, you know, hey, I'm Indigenous, so this is what it means. Indigenous itself is a very political term. Like there's so many political terms that people call ourselves and what we are and what we identify as. But when we get down to it, you belong to a community and you have to belong to a community, but there's so many complex issues like, people reconnecting. And I think sometimes we get a lot of people who want to claim an Indigenous identity but don't actually know what that means. And they don't know what it is they're actually looking for. And I feel like that needs to be more of the conversation of how do you determine if you are Indigenous or not? Because the sad part is you can't go on family lore. You can't. You can't base it off of, my family said this. Because the problem is a lot of times, especially back in the day, from my understanding and a lot of conversations I've had with people, is that, sometimes it was easier to say, oh, I'm this instead of this, And so that then gets passed on and it's not actually rooted in truth. But even then, it's not just about having doing a DNA test and being like, oh, I found out I'm Indigenous. That's great. Awesome. Love that for you. But where is your family from? As an Indigenous woman, as a Cree woman, as someone who's Innu or Illilu, because I'm not there are different types of Cree in itself. And even then the word Cree comes from the French. It was given to us by the French. I think I heard it was that they saw us praying all the time. So the French gave us the name the Cree. So, and if it also the Dakota Sioux, Sioux as well. If it begins with an X, that name was given to you by the French. So that's not actually our original term. It's not what we call the people. The people for me and for my community is Innu or Illilu. It just means that I'm N dialect or L dialect. It depends on where I'm coming from. And so where you're from and your connection is so important. I know where I'm from. I know where my family's from. I belong to a First Nation. I'm a member of Quechua First Nation or Albany Band. And, I know what my connection is. And I know that there's a lot of people that are disconnected and they're still trying to find what that connection is. And so you can't just take on an identity if you're not willing to do the work. So for me, I think it's important that if you are gonna claim an Indigenous identity, you have to do the work to figure out where you're from and what people you belong to. Where's your connection? And even in our communities, I was talking to my mom and my aunt about this the other day. Our communities, we gossip a lot. So even if you were removed, if you even just know who your parents were or things like that, it's easier to figure out how you're connected by those connections. And, being Indigenous is not only just about I'm from this place. It's a connection to the culture, the language, the food. There's so many things. And I understand that people are reconnecting. And so it's reconnecting to that, not a label. You want to connect to the culture. And so figuring out what that is so important. I feel like resources, one of the resources that I like to use is either the United Nations or the Amnesty International. Sad thing is, and me and my coworker actually had a discussion about it, how a lot of definitions of what it means to be Indigenous is kind of rooted in oppression, really, because, it's basically you have a culture and a dominant culture came over and now occupies that land of the dominant culture. And so you have your own distinct languages and cultures and customs that are still, trying to survive in this world where you have a dominant culture on it. And so that's kind of, if I had to summarize what Indigenous meant, that's probably the easiest one. And there are Indigenous people from all around the world. There are over 5,000 Indigenous peoples. There's so much studies and work that has been done into who Indigenous people are. So again, I know everyone wants to belong and feel like they're part of a community in some way, but unfortunately you have to do the work. You have to do the work to identify what that means and know that if you are gonna take on an Indigenous label in some way, that you might have to answer these questions. You might need to know who your people are, which community you belong to. And if you can't even answer those basic questions, then I would say don't do it. I would figure out what those things are beforehand. Because it's not as simple as, oh, I did a DNA test and I'm this much Indigenous. No, it's so much bigger than that. Indigenous identity is so complex. I mean, we're one of the few people that has to prove our indigeneity by blood quantum in the United States. We don't use blood quantum in Canada. We have a different system, which is different. But, and if you think of blood quantum in general, it's like, what is it? Breeding in dogs or blood quantum? Like, the only thing I can think of is a lot of us have treaties and ties to the land. And a lot of times we talk about how it's almost like they're trying to breed us out of existence so that we get so, minuscule. And so we don't have this connection anymore. So they don't have to consult us anymore. There's a whole thing about it. Anyways, I really feel like we don't talk about enough about how we talk about, pretendians. We talk about, the pretendian hunters, all that stuff, like whatever. Cool. Awesome. But I think sometimes it's more than that. I think some people just really want to connect, and it's like trying to somehow put it in a way that saying like, if you want to like claim an Indigenous identity, you have to do the work first and foremost. And know that people will question you on it. And if you cannot answer questions or simple questions like which community you belong to, which nation or tribe, if you don't even know that information with certainty, because the problem with that as well is that this is where people like shift all the time. They're like, I'm from this community, this community, this community. That is a big red flag. If you don't know which community you're from and you're constantly switching where you're from, that's a big red flag. Because a lot of times those are people that are mining for data from Indigenous peoples and trying to claim from communities because they've heard about a place, or they're like, oh, my family's from here, so I must be part of this group. No, you need to know. You should know before you're publicly going to say, I belong to these people, because I guarantee it, that community is going to say, oh, okay, well, who's your family member? And if you can't answer those questions, that's where you're going to get a little, that's where you're going to get caught up in the, people are now going to start labeling you as a pretendian or someone who doesn't know. And maybe you are and you just don't know. So I suggest knowing before you claim an identity. Because as Indigenous people, I want to say we suffered. I hate saying we suffered, but we did. The truth is we have. So many things have happened in our communities. My mother was in a TB sanatorium. My mother went to a residential school. My mother was technically part of the 60s scoop. Technically. My mom didn't even learn English till she was 16. These are the struggles of people. And we still have people, I still have to go on the internet and listen to people tell me that residential school didn't exist when I know the harm that it's done to my family. I know the stories. I've known the stories for majority of my life. And so it's hard when you grow up with these issues and these struggles, and people just now want to claim an identity, but don't understand that it's so much more complex than I just want to belong to this group. You have to know which group you belong to. And you can't just say, oh, I'm Native American, I'm Indigenous, whatever. You have to know that in itself is the umbrella term, but you need to actually know which community you come from. And so, I don't know. I feel like we don't talk about that enough. And telling people, do that. So yeah. Again, Amnesty International. So go to amnesty.org. I feel like it has a good definition of what Indigenous means, and I feel like it'd be a good resource. So if you want to learn more, just, yeah, do the work.